Hey guys, welcome back to another late-night journey into the soft underbelly of history where the candles flicker, the medieval world hums quietly in the dark, and everyone's just a little too religious for their own good. So, go ahead, dim your lights, maybe make some tea or whatever potion helps you unwind. Tonight, we're going back to a time when Europe was caught between faith and famine, when kings were moody, the church was powerful, and people honestly believed they could walk to Jerusalem if they just really meant it. This is the story of the Children's Crusade of 1212, a story about thousands of children who supposedly set out to reclaim the Holy Land without weapons, without food, and without much sense, because they thought God would part the seas for them. And spoiler, he didn't. But this isn't a war story. It's a quiet one about faith, desperation, and the kind of mass delusion that only the Middle Ages could produce. So let's settle in. The year is 1212, somewhere between superstition, starvation, and divine confusion. Let's start by remembering where Europe was mentally at this point. By 1212, the adults had already tried crusading. Several times, actually. The first crusade had been, by medieval standards, a massive success. Knights returned home bragging about bathing in holy blood. Everyone felt very righteous, and new kingdoms were set up in the Middle East. Then came the Second Crusade, which was less inspiring. The Third Crusade brought us Richard the Lionheart, who was called the Lionheart mostly because angry guy who never actually won Jerusalem didn't sound heroic enough. And by the Fourth Crusade, they weren't even fighting Muslims anymore. They got sidetracked and accidentally sacked Constantinople, which, if you're not great at geography, was a Christian city. So yeah, things were going great. By the early 13th century, the crusading spirit was alive but confused. The church kept promising salvation for anyone willing to take the cross, but the constant disasters made it feel like God wasn't returning calls anymore. And then, in the midst of all this holy chaos, the idea of a children's crusade appeared. Because when grown men fail at something repeatedly, obviously the next step is to send in the 12-year-olds. Now, the story is tricky, because we're never quite sure what really happened. Medieval chroniclers weren't exactly journalists. They were more like enthusiastic gossipers with quills. So what we have is part fact, part legend, and part medieval game of telephone. Still, the general outline goes like this. In 1212, two separate movements of children, one in France, one in Germany, set off, each claiming that God had chosen them to succeed where the adults failed. They would reclaim the Holy Land peacefully, armed with nothing but faith. It's kind of sweet, in a tragic way. Imagine thousands of peasant kids, all under 15, marching across Europe with crosses made of sticks, singing hymns, barefoot, convinced they could walk across the sea because Moses did it once in a story. If this sounds like a bad idea, you're right. But that's also what makes it so haunting. Let's start with the French version. In the quiet countryside of northern France, there was a shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes. He was about 12 years old, which in medieval terms was basically middle management. According to legend, Stephen claimed that Jesus himself appeared to him disguised as a poor pilgrim. And because no one in medieval France had ever heard the phrase, stranger danger, Stephen did exactly what the mysterious man told him to do: deliver letters to King Philip II of France. The letters, allegedly from Christ, urged the king to lead a new crusade. Philip, who was many things, but not a fool, took one look at this sweaty shepherd boy and politely declined. But Stephen didn't stop there. If the king wouldn't lead the crusade, he would. Word spread fast, and soon, thousands of children, teenagers, and probably a few wandering adults who just got caught up in the chaos, gathered around Stephen, ready to follow him to the Holy Land. Chroniclers say there were around 30,000 of them. That number is definitely exaggerated, but even if it was a few thousand, that's still a shocking sight. Imagine the roads of medieval France dusty, lined with wildflowers, and villages suddenly filled with barefoot children singing hymns about Jerusalem, carrying banners, walking toward a promise no one could fulfill. Now, it's important to understand the mindset of these kids. Most were peasants. They had never been more than a few miles from their homes. They didn't really understand geography. Jerusalem might as well have been at the end of a rainbow, and their lives were hard. The year 1212 was hot, the harvests were bad, and Europe was tired. So when someone said, God wants you to save the world, it must have sounded like the only exciting thing that had ever happened to them. It's sad, but also very human. Faith, hope, and a total lack of adult supervision, the perfect medieval cocktail. The French movement, under Stephen, began marching toward the Mediterranean coast, believing that when they reached the sea, it would part for them. Because, that's how these stories usually go. They reached the port of Marseille. The sea, as usual, remained completely unimpressed. Some cried, some prayed, some probably wondered if they should have just stayed home and milked the cows. Then, according to one of the darker versions of the story, two local merchants named Hugh the Iron and William the Pig, yes, those were their real nicknames, appeared. They told the children that the sea didn't need to part because they had ships. Ships that could take them all to the Holy Land for free, out of the kindness of their hearts. And of course, that's exactly what every medieval child wanted to hear. So, several thousand of them boarded these ships. And that was the last anyone ever saw of them. Let's pause here, take a slow breath, and remember this is a bedtime story. A sad one, yes, but we're drifting through it gently. According to legend, those ships never reached Jerusalem. Some say a storm sank them. Others say the merchants sold the children into slavery in North Africa. A few chroniclers claimed only 2 ships made it to Egypt, where the children were enslaved or died. Whatever happened, Stephen disappeared from history. Some said he was martyred. Others said he just went home and kept tending sheep, now famous and haunted. The church, by the way, tried to suppress the story because it was embarrassing. It didn't look great for Christendom that thousands of its children wandered off into oblivion, believing they could do what grown men couldn't. Now, while all this was happening in France, a similar story was unfolding in Germany, because apparently, bad ideas travel fast. Up north, in the Rhineland, there was a boy named Nicholas, about 10 or 12 years old, maybe older, no one really knows. Like Stephen, he claimed to have been inspired by God. His mission, lead a peaceful crusade of children to the Holy Land, converting Muslims through pure faith. And somehow, it worked. Thousands of German children and their parents this time, because the Germans at least sent some supervision, began marching south toward Italy. Their route took them over the Alps, barefoot. In the summer, it was less a crusade and more a very slow, very fatal hiking trip. Many died along the way from exhaustion, hunger, or simply getting lost. But enough of them made it to the Italian coast that the Pope himself, Innocent III, ironically named, heard about it. When the bedraggled children finally reached Rome, expecting divine approval, Innocent met them and said, essentially, your faith is beautiful, but also, go home. Which is medieval for, what on earth were you thinking? Some did go home, some didn't. Some vanished, and Nicholas, the boy who started it all, disappeared into legend. One rumor said he died in Italy. Another claimed he made it to the Holy Land and was enslaved. No one really knows. The Children's Crusade became one of those medieval ghost stories whispered about for centuries, part miracle, part tragedy, part metaphor. Let's float gently into the next part of this tale, where we'll explore how adults tried to explain the strange mass pilgrimage and what it says about faith, manipulation, and the medieval mind.
Part 2. The Faith, the Fables, and the Fog of the Middle Ages. So, where were we? Thousands of children had vanished into the haze of 1212. The Mediterranean had swallowed them, or maybe the merchants had. The chroniclers argued, the priests prayed, and somewhere in northern France, a few bewildered parents were probably wondering if this was all part of God's plan, or just another case of medieval bad luck. Now, you might be wondering, how could something like this even happen? Why would anyone, anywhere, think that a crusade made entirely of children was a good idea? Well, that's the thing. No one planned it. The Children's Crusade wasn't announced by the Pope. It wasn't organized by the Church. It just happened. It grew out of the strange, feverish soil of early 13th century Europe, a world constantly teetering between divine hope and total despair. Let's picture Europe around 1212 for a moment. It was an age of faith, but also famine. You were told every day that the world was temporary and heaven was forever. Disease was random, death was common, and the church had a monopoly on meaning. If you were poor, and most people were, you didn't own much. But you did own your soul. And if you wanted to invest that soul wisely, crusading was like a spiritual stock market, dangerous, prestigious, and supposedly very profitable in heaven. The idea that children, with their innocence, might somehow achieve what adult knights couldn't, that they could reach Jerusalem by pure faith alone, actually made sense to the medieval mind. Because innocence was currency. And when the adults had failed so often, maybe it was time to let the purest among them try. But of course, even innocence needs logistics. If we look past the legend, the Children's Crusade was probably less of a crusade and more of a wandering pilgrimage. A sort of runaway movement, hundreds of children, teenagers, peasants, maybe a few wandering adults or beggars, all caught up in the same emotional wave. When one chronicler says 30,000, we can translate that roughly to a lot, enough to fill the roads, enough to make towns nervous, enough to make bishops start writing concerned letters. Some of those letters survive. They describe the groups as pueri, Latin for boys, but also used as a slang term for the poor. So when we say Children's Crusade, it might have really meant the poor man's crusade, not just literal kids, but the desperate, the homeless, the wandering, the forgotten. Which makes the story even sadder, in a way. These weren't just naive children. They were people at the edge of survival, walking toward a miracle because nothing else was left. Let's pause, breathe, and picture them. A long road winding south through France and Germany. Bare feet, dust, the sound of singing that drifts across the hills like mist. Some hold wooden crosses. Some carry bread that's already gone stale. Some are too young to know what Jerusalem even is. When we think of crusades, we picture knights in shining armor. But this one looked more like a lost procession, a pilgrimage of exhaustion and faith, under a sun that never seemed to set. Now, the church, as you might imagine, was not thrilled. Pope Innocent III, a man who once launched a crusade against his own heretics in France, had to walk a delicate line. When the German children reached Rome and collapsed at his feet, he couldn't exactly scold them. That would have made him look like the villain in a sermon. So he told them, in his gentle papal way, that their faith was beautiful, but also that maybe they should leave crusading to the adults. It was the medieval equivalent of patting them on the head and saying, "Sweet effort, kids. Go home before you die," some did. But most didn't. Some died on the return journey. Some settled in Italian towns, too weak or ashamed to go back. Some, the chroniclers say, joined merchant ships that promised them safe passage, which, if you remember how the French expedition went, was a very bad sign. The idea of children being sold into slavery was horrifying enough that later storytellers leaned into it, turning the tale into a moral lesson. A warning about misplaced faith, false prophets, and the dangers of believing too much in human goodness. Which, in a way, was the medieval version of Don't Talk to Strangers, but this story didn't die with the children. It grew, for centuries afterward. Writers, monks, and historians couldn't leave it alone. Each generation rewrote it, softened it, reshaped it, sometimes as a tale of divine purity, other times as a dark fable of deception. By the 13th century, it was already half legend. By the 15th, it was myth. And by the 19th, it became the kind of story that poets and painters loved, because it had everything: innocence, tragedy, and a sea that refused to part. Now, let's drift a bit deeper, not into the sea, but into the why of it all. What made this moment possible? What made thousands of people believe that children could march across the world and succeed? To answer that, we have to remember that the medieval world was powered by stories. The Bible wasn't just scripture, it was an action-adventure series with miracles on every page. You had seas parting, mountains moving, the dead coming back to life. And if you lived in a time when most people couldn't read, those stories weren't metaphors, they were news reports. So when Stephen or Nicholas said, "God will part the sea for us," it didn't sound insane. It sounded possible. It's a bit like hearing a modern child say, "I'll be an astronaut." It's unrealistic, but you don't laugh, because it's hope, and hope was all anyone had. Now, historians today like to debate how much of this story actually happened. Some argue there was never a single, organized children's crusade at all, just several unrelated pilgrimages that later got combined into one convenient tragedy. Others think it was exaggerated by chroniclers who couldn't resist turning real events into moral theatre. But even if we strip away the exaggerations, something very real happened in 1212. There were large groups of children and peasants who tried to reach the sea. They did believe they were going to Jerusalem. And most of them never came home. That's enough truth for one tragedy. Let's float now to the quieter aftermath. What happened when the song stopped and the roads were empty again? Back in France, King Philip II wasn't thrilled. He'd already told Stephen to stay home once. Now thousands of his peasants were missing, and rumors were flying that merchants had sold them into slavery. Philip, ever the practical monarch, ordered an investigation. But like most medieval investigations, it didn't exactly end in answers. The merchants, if they existed, were long gone. And the church, embarrassed, quietly shifted the blame to overzealous faith, which, in medieval terms, was basically the same as saying, "We don't talk about that anymore," and so the Children's Crusade slipped into memory, half fact, half sermon. The monks who wrote about it did so in a tone of pained admiration. They called it a story of pure hearts misled, a warning that even innocence can go astray when it forgets to ask for permission. And in their quiet, candlelit scriptoria, they must have wondered, what did those children really see, out there on the road to nowhere? Did they still believe, even when the sea didn't move? Maybe that's why the story never died, because it's not really about religion or war. It's about the human need to believe that something bigger will save us, and the heartbreak that comes when it doesn't, a tale of children walking toward a miracle and finding only the world instead.
Part 3, Echoes of the Lost: How the World Remembered the Children. Hey there. If you're still with me, I hope your eyes are getting heavy. Maybe the room's a little darker now. Maybe your tea's gone cold. That's fine. This isn't a story that rushes anywhere. History, like sleep, works better when you drift through it. So, let's pick up the thread, the one the children dropped somewhere between the Alps and the sea, and follow it forward through time. Because even after they vanished, the world couldn't stop talking about them. When something tragic happens in the Middle Ages, it never just stops. It echoes. Every monk, every preacher, every traveler with a half-empty notebook has to add their own version. And so, the Children's Crusade became one of those stories that everyone thought they knew, even though no one really did. By the late 1200s, it had grown taller in the telling. Stephen of Cloyes was no longer just a shepherd boy, he was a prophet. Nicholas, the German leader, became a saintly visionary. The numbers swelled from a few thousand to 40,000, because medieval chroniclers had no chill when it came to exaggeration. And the ships that vanished, they became ghost ships. Stories said they sailed endlessly across the sea, crewed by the souls of the lost children forever trying to reach Jerusalem, which is darkly beautiful, in a bedtime kind of way. Now, to understand why people clung to this story, we have to remember something. The Middle Ages loved a moral. Every tragedy was a sermon waiting to happen. If a storm sank your town, it was God's punishment. If a saint's bones cured your rash, it was God's mercy. And if thousands of children disappeared on a crusade, well, that had to mean something. So, writers turned it into a parable. Some said it was proof that blind faith, without reason, leads only to ruin. Others said it showed the world's cruelty, that innocence cannot survive without guidance. And a few, the more romantic kind, believed it was a holy mystery, that maybe, just maybe, those children did reach the Holy Land, not in body, but in spirit. You can almost picture it somewhere beyond the desert, a vision of barefoot children singing as they walk into heaven. It's sad. It's absurd. It's exactly the kind of thing a medieval monk would write after too much wine and not enough daylight. As the centuries went on, the story kept evolving. Each retelling reflected its own time, its fears, its politics, its guilt. In the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe was getting darker. The plague had swept through, leaving empty villages and empty cradles. Faith was still strong, but also more anxious, more desperate to explain suffering. So the Children's Crusade became a cautionary tale again. Priests used it as proof that people should trust the church, not their own visions. See what happens when you let the children lead, they'd say from the pulpit. It was the Middle Ages version of, don't believe everything you read on the internet. And the irony, of course, is that these same sermons would then tell people to go fight new crusades. Because medieval logic was nothing if not consistent in its inconsistency. Let's glide forward another few centuries to the Renaissance, a time when scholars started to dust off the past, poke it, and ask, wait, did that actually happen? Humanist writers like Erasmus began to look back on the medieval world with equal parts awe and amusement. The story of the lost crusading children started to feel like an allegory, a symbol of innocence devoured by ambition. Painters, too, found it irresistible. Renaissance art loved tragedy wrapped in holiness. So you'd see these dreamy depictions of young, haloed pilgrims walking toward a sunlit horizon, kind of Christian version of the Pied Piper, only more tragic and less musical. And that comparison, actually, isn't far off. Because the Pied Piper of Hamelin, the story of a mysterious man leading the town's children away, emerged in the same cultural moment. Some historians even think the Children's Crusade helped inspire it. A real disappearance, softened into a fable. The world remembered, but not clearly. Memory blurred into myth, and myth, as always, was easier to live with. Let's float ahead again to the 19th century. This is where the story found its second life. Europe was romantic again. People were obsessed with lost causes, tragic beauty, and noble suffering, the same energy that makes someone write 300 pages about a doomed poet in a cold garret. Writers like Marcel Schwab and Paul Sabatier revived the story of the Children's Crusade, wrapping it in melancholy and wonder. It became a symbol of purity in a cynical world, the idea that these children, uncorrupted by greed, dared to dream something holy. And for the Romantics, it was the ultimate metaphor, the death of faith in a faithless world. By the early 20th century, the story had settled into literature and psychology alike. Sigmund Freud, ever the party guest, saw it as an example of mass hysteria, children acting out the repressed desires of their parents. Others saw it as a symbol of idealism crushed by reality, which, honestly, describes most of human history. Even today, the Children's Crusade still drifts through books and films. It shows up as a metaphor for lost innocence, misplaced faith, or the quiet cruelty of hope. You can find it in poetry, in novels, even in songs that don't name it outright, just that image of children walking toward something they'll never reach. It's strange how the past refuses to stay buried. Somewhere in our collective imagination, those barefoot pilgrims are still walking across pages, across centuries toward a sea that never moves. Now, before we drift to the end of their trail, let's pause again and talk about what this story tells us about us. Because history isn't really about the past. It's about how we use the past to explain ourselves. The Children's Crusade keeps resurfacing because it touches something timeless, the way innocence and ambition get tangled up. It's about the thin line between faith and delusion, between following a dream and walking off a cliff. And it's about adults, always watching the young, sending them off, believing that maybe their purity will fix what we've broken. Spoiler, it never does. But we keep trying anyway. If you listen closely, the echoes of that march still hum in modern times. Every generation has its children's crusade. Not always literal, sometimes political, sometimes social, but always that same energy of idealism colliding with a world that doesn't care. We send young people to wars we don't understand. We ask them to change the world we've already damaged. And when they fail, we turn them into symbols just like Stephen, just like Nicholas. Maybe that's the real meaning of the story. We keep walking the same road, pretending it leads somewhere new. The Children's Crusade isn't history you can tidy up with a moral. It's more like a dream you can't shake, confusing, sad, a little absurd, and too beautiful to forget. Those children might never have reached Jerusalem, but their story did. It crossed oceans, rewrote itself in every age, and became a quiet reminder that faith, even misguided faith, leaves footprints that never wash away. And maybe, somewhere on a long, dark road in France, if you close your eyes, you can still hear it. The faint sound of young voices, singing in a language older than history, heading south, toward the sea, toward a promise they could never keep, and a world that never really deserved them. Part 4. The Quiet Truth, What Might Have Really Happened. Hey again. If you've made it this far, that probably means you're either genuinely curious, or you've already dozed off, and this is just background noise for your dreams. Either way, we're going to keep the tone soft, calm, and slow, because this is the part where we take the story, this medieval ghost of faith and tragedy, and gently, carefully, hold it up to the light. We'll look at what modern historians actually think really happened. Spoiler, it's less mystical and more human, but somehow that makes it even sadder. Let's start with the confession. The Children's Crusade probably didn't look the way most people imagine it. Not an endless line of tiny pilgrims in white robes. Not a literal army of orphans marching through Europe like a biblical flash mob. The truth, as usual, is muddier. What likely happened in 1212 was a collection of small, uncoordinated pilgrimages. Different groups, in different towns, all carried by the same spiritual fever that was sweeping across Europe at the time. They weren't all children either. Some were teenagers, apprentices, beggars, peasants, widows, the wandering poor. But children became the label that stuck. Because it sounded purer, it made a better story, and the Middle Ages loved a good story, even if it was terrible. So, how do we know any of this? Well, historians have combed through the surviving chronicles, about 50 of them written between the 13th and 15th centuries. They come from France, Germany, Italy, and England, and they don't agree on much. Some say the leader was named Stephen, some say Nicholas, some say both existed, separately. Others suggest the whole thing was a moral allegory that got mistaken for an event. But when you start comparing the small, quiet details, you notice patterns. References to poor villagers walking south. Mentions of children begging in Italy, saying they came from France or the Rhineland. Letters from bishops, asking what to do with bands of innocent pilgrims. These aren't legends. They're administrative headaches, which is often the most reliable kind of evidence. So maybe that's what the Children's Crusade really was, not a single dramatic march, but dozens of small ones. Bands of the devout poor, carried by a wave of apocalyptic hope, wandering toward the Mediterranean with songs on their lips and no plan whatsoever. They probably expected miracles, but what they got was heat, hunger, and the occasional angry farmer. As they moved south, some drifted into towns, found work, or simply gave up and went home. Others made it to the sea, where merchants, ever the opportunists, saw a chance to profit. In Marseille and Genoa, ships really did exist that took poor pilgrims to sea, and some of those ships never came back. Was it a storm? Pirates? Slave traders? No one knows. But it's easy to see how one vanished ship could become, in retelling, an entire lost crusade. Now, here's where things get eerily specific. A few decades after 1212, Pope Gregory IX received a report that a group of young Christian slaves had been found in North Africa, people who claimed to have been taken there as children during a holy journey. Coincidence? Maybe. But it does make you wonder if pieces of the story survived, scattered across the coasts, like driftwood. And then there are records from Genoa mentioning a group of German boys who showed up starving, claiming to have come for the crusade. The city fed them, clothed them, and quietly sent them home. So yes, parts of the story are real, but not the miracle, and not the mass disappearance. Just people poor, hopeful, and lost, walking towards something that never existed. Let's float for a moment in that space between myth and truth. Because when you strip away the holy glow, the Children's Crusade stops being about faith and starts being about poverty. Europe in 1212 was full of children without homes, parents without food, and families crushed by taxes, droughts, and disease. When someone said, "Let's walk to Jerusalem and everything will be better," it didn't sound insane. It sounded like hope. And hope is powerful, especially when you have nothing else to lose. That's the quiet part of this story that the chroniclers didn't always understand. They thought they were writing about religion, but really, they were writing about desperation. Even the word crusade complicates things. In Latin, it was peregrinatio, pilgrimage, the idea of setting out for God, not necessarily fighting for him. So these children, or peasants, or whoever they were, weren't trying to conquer anything. They were just trying to reach the holy city, maybe to pray, maybe to start over, maybe just to arrive somewhere that wasn't home. And in that sense, it's less about tragedy and more about longing, a very human thing, dressed up in medieval faith. But of course, history can't leave anything simple. Over time, artists, poets, and even preachers reshaped the story until it became something else entirely: a symbol, a warning, a myth of purity destroyed by the world. The church eventually embraced the tale not as a stain, but as a parable. They said it showed the danger of unapproved zeal, which is church speak for, please don't do anything without our permission. And yet, the tone of those sermons was always tinged with guilt, as if even they couldn't quite shake the image of thousands of innocent faces vanishing over the horizon. Modern historians, though, have been gentler. They don't mock the children. They don't even call them foolish. They see them as victims of their own world, caught in a culture that mixed religion with desperation until the two were indistinguishable. Some compare it to later mass movements like the flagellants during the plague, or the revival preachers of early modern Europe. Moments when fear and hope get tangled together, and people start walking because standing still feels unbearable. And really, that's something we still understand. Maybe not barefoot across continents, but in our own ways, chasing meaning, chasing hope, even when the destination keeps moving. Let's pause here for a moment, because if you were to visit the places they passed, Cloyes in France, Cologne in Germany, the ports of Marseille and Genoa, you wouldn't find monuments or memorials. There are no statues of Stephen or Nicholas, no shrines to the missing, just towns, rivers, and roads, quiet under the same sun. History forgets most of its children. It's always been that way, but the memory lingers in the air, the faint sense that once, long ago, a crowd of voices sang their way through here, dreaming of a place they'd never seen. And in the end, maybe that's enough. Not every story needs resolution. Some just need to be remembered gently, like a candle left to burn out on its own. The Children's Crusade reminds us that faith, however misplaced, is still a form of love. A love so strong it walks into the unknown, even when the world offers nothing in return. They didn't conquer Jerusalem. They didn't part the sea. But they left behind something quieter, a question that still hums in the background of history. How far would you walk for something you believe in? And would you know when to stop? So, as we close our eyes on this story, imagine it not as a tragedy, but as a lullaby. A low, endless hymn, carried by wind across the fields of France, over the Alps, and down to the sea, where the waves still move, but never part. That's where we'll leave them, the lost children of the crusade. Not gone, just walking forever in the gentle rhythm of belief. Good night, traveler, and may your dreams take kinder roads than theirs did.